Chapter 1. The Garage. The garage behind Hollis Parnell's house was not much to look at from the outside, just a long, low structure, sided and weathered boards that had once been white before surrendering to the slow, patient work of Arkansas sun. But inside, it held a kind of order rarely found in nature or among men. Every tool had its place, every place had a tool, and nothing ever wandered far from where it belonged. The fan in the corner, an off-brand machine from a long-dead hardware store, shoved hot air around without cooling anything. Its primary function, as far as Hollis could tell, was producing a noise that masked the sound of his own thoughts. Sometimes that counted for something. On his workbench sat the half-restored motorcycle engine, polished aluminum, dark steel, and the persistent smell of oil that had lived in the pores of the room for 30 years. The machine belonged to a man from over toward Milo, who wanted it finished before the bicentennial fireworks, 'cause he had some notion of riding it triumphantly into the night with a small American flag trailing behind him. Hollis suspected the flag was the real priority. He reached for a socket wrench and paused halfway, noticing a smudge on the handle. Not dirt, just something out of place. He wiped it with a cloth and nodded, satisfied. Tools deserved respect. People often didn't earn it. The morning sunlight came through the garage door in a broad shaft, illuminating dust motes that swirled in slow, deliberate choreography, as though even the particles were hesitant to rush. Outside, the July air already carried that heavy, unshakable humidity that made shirts cling to skin and tempers shorten by noon. Inside, the heat settled like a second body, breathing down the back of Hollis's neck. He adjusted a carburetor piece, then rummaged in a drawer for the magneto assembly. When his hand came up empty, he frowned. Not the irritated kind of frown, but the puzzled kind a mechanic gives when something in his mental inventory fails to match the physical world. "That can't be right," he muttered, mostly to the empty air, but partly to the engine itself. Machines responded better when you talked to them in a calm voice. He checked the shelf above the bench. A row of parts catalogs and jars full of bolts looked back at him, entirely unhelpful. He checked the second drawer of the tall cabinet, then the third. Nothing. He straightened up slowly, the realization sinking in with the weight of inevitability. The magneto cap, the specific, period-correct piece this machine needed, was gone. Not misplaced, not borrowed, gone. He went through the 5 stages of mechanical grief. Confusion. It should be here. Denial. It must be under something. Suspicion. Maybe someone took it. Resentment. Why today of all days? Acceptance. Old man Fitzhugh would have one. The 5th stage was the worst of the lot. Hollis set the wrench down and wiped his palms on the rag he kept folded in his back pocket. Harlan Fitzhugh was not the kind of man you visited lightly. He was the sort of recluse who made reclusiveness into both lifestyle and sport. Folks said he'd been a machinist for Crossit back in the early days, the sort who could turn scrap metal into a working engine given enough time and coffee. These days, he lived on the far side of town, surrounded by rusted machines and overpriced secrets. But if anyone in Ashley County had a magneto cap that matched this particular model, it was him. Hollis exhaled, the kind of slow breath one gives before lifting a heavy box or opening a letter he doesn't want to read. Then he shut off the fan, more out of habit than effect, and walked out into the morning. The sunlight hit him with a force that felt personal. Hamburg was alive already, too alive in his opinion. He could hear faint music drifting over from town. Someone was rehearsing for the parade. A shrill whistle cut the air. Firecrackers popped in the distance like someone stepping on a nest of miniature explosions. Hollis paused at the edge of his yard, listening. Cars passed on the main road, full of people heading toward the square. Kids rode bicycles decorated with crepe paper. The whole county seemed determined to be cheerful, loud, and late. Hollis, for his part, had no intention of being cheerful and loud, but he was about to be late. He locked the garage door out of principle. No one in Ashley County had ever stolen a single thing from him, but a locked door made the world feel orderly, and walked to his truck. The cab was hot enough to bake bread. He rolled down the windows, let the air out, and settled behind the wheel. As he turned the key, the radio crackled to life, midway through a choir rendition of In the Sweet and By and By. Someone had the volume up too high, which made the sopranos hit notes that seemed aimed at structural damage. Hollis turned it off. He backed down the gravel drive, watching the dust plume in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he considered leaving the motorcycle alone and telling its owner that the part was simply not to be found today. But that wasn't how he did things. If a job could be done right, it should be done right. There are too many people in the world that settle for good enough. He nudged the truck onto the road and headed toward town. The sun glared off the hood. A pickup loaded with children passed him in the opposite lane, the bed piled with flags large enough to declare sovereignty. Someone honked a greeting. Hollis lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel, the universal gesture of acknowledgement in rural Arkansas. Enough to say, "I saw you," but not enough to start a conversation. As the closer he got to Hamburg Square, the more obvious it became that the bicentennial was not going to make things easy. Cars lined the streets, people in red, white, and blue shirts wandered the sidewalks. A man wearing a stovepipe hat stood outside the courthouse, though the courthouse wasn't there anymore and hadn't been for a decade. Hollis eased the truck forward, mentally preparing for whatever new inconvenience awaited him. He had survived a war, a lifetime of Arkansas summers, and several decades of misplaced American enthusiasm. He could handle this, probably. He turned a corner and saw the barricades, and behind them, the crowd. Hollis sighed, shifted into park, and rested his hands on the steering wheel. This was going to take more time than he liked, but the motorcycle wasn't going to fix itself. And so, with the reluctant patience of a man who'd been forced into many things he didn't want to do, Hollis stepped out into the noise and began the long walk toward the only man in the county who could help him, Harlan Fitzhugh, a man who made rare parts, a man who avoided parades, a man whose house was now separated from Hollis by an entire county's worth of patriotic enthusiasm. Hollis squared his shoulders, shut the truck door, and walked into the heat. The day had begun.
Chapter 2. The Road to Town. Hollis backed the truck out of the drive with the slow, steady confidence of a man who had done it 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. Gravel crackled under the tires, then fanned out in a small arc behind him, hanging briefly in the morning air before settling back down exactly where it had come from. Even the dust on that road seemed accustomed to routine. He eased onto the highway and rolled the windows down. The air that rushed in wasn't cool, not even close, but it was moving, and that alone made it feel like companionship. July had a way of making the whole state feel like an occupied territory. Heat laying siege to every porch, ditch, pasture, and soul unfortunate enough to leave the house. But the wind, hot or not, reminded you there was still motion in the world. His radio crackled again. Someone's handbell choir was attempting a bicentennial arrangement of In the Sweet By and By. Every third note sounded like a dropped wrench. Hollis turned the radio off so decisively that the knob clicked harder than usual. He didn't mind the song itself. He'd heard it all his life, during funerals, picnics, and revivals, but hearing it filtered through a collection of offbeat handbells felt like a personal attack. A pickup passed him in the opposite lane, loaded with children waving small American flags. One kid, standing upright in the truck bed like a tiny general, threw his whole arm into the air and yelled something patriotic that Hollis didn't quite catch over the wind. He lifted 2 fingers from the wheel in acknowledgement. It was the Arkansas version of a salute, and the kid seemed satisfied with it. Up ahead, a woman stood at the edge of her yard arranging lawn chairs in rows as if preparing for an outdoor wedding. The chairs all faced the street. A hand-painted sign leaned against her mailbox. Parade viewing. Seats $1. Comes with ice water. Hollis admired the entrepreneurial spirit, even if the execution needed work.
He drove a few more miles and passed 2 teenagers riding bicycles decorated with crepe paper streamers. One of them, barefoot, balanced a boombox on the handlebars playing a staticky version of Yankee Doodle that cut out every time the bike hit a bump. The boy didn't seem to notice, or care, or believe in the concept of obstacles generally. The next hill offered a clear view of the town. Hamburg lay ahead like a patchwork quilt someone had washed too many times, colors a little faded, edges a little frayed, but the pattern still visible if you looked at it with the right kind of affection. Hollis had never left for long. Not for college, not for the mills, not for anything except Korea, which had been long enough. He'd come home and stayed home. People sometimes asked him why. He didn't have a good answer for them, or at least not one they wanted to hear. The truth was that leaving seemed like trouble, and contrary to popular belief, staying in one place could be its own kind of freedom. He slowed at the intersection where the old feed mill once stood. A trailer now occupied the space, selling bicentennial T-shirts. A banner stretched above it. Hamburg AR, 2 centuries of doing our best. A bold claim, Hollis thought, for a town that once had 3 grocery stores and now barely had 1. As he crossed into town, the usual rhythms of a summer morning had been replaced by a kind of cheerful disorder that only happened on parade days. Cars lined both sides of the street. Children darted unpredictably, some wearing colonial hats made of construction paper that drooped pitifully in the humidity. Men carried coolers. Women carried purses big enough to smuggle artillery shells. Hollis pulled into a small gravel lot behind the barber shop, knowing he wouldn't get any closer to the square in the truck. He parked in the shade of a pecan tree that was losing more leaves than a healthy tree should. The ground beneath it was littered with pecan shells, many split open by squirrels who treated the place like a permanent cafeteria. When he stepped out of the truck, the heat hit him square in the jaw, thick, immediate, and without apology. Hamburg heat didn't ask permission. It arrived with the confidence of a family member using your bathtub without knocking. He locked the truck and pocketed the key. He checked his watch, still early enough to beat the worst of the crowd, he hoped. He didn't hate crowds. He simply preferred being alone in the same way other people preferred company. To him, solitude wasn't absence, it was clarity. Noise confused the world. Too many people at once made it harder to tell which thoughts were his and which ones had wandered in from somebody else's. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the square. The scent of charcoal drifted from somewhere down the road. Firecrackers snapped. Someone shouted for a boy named Cale to quit swinging that thing unless you mean it. A dog barked. Another dog answered. A baby wailed. Someone dropped a box of cookies. Small town symphony. Hollis walked past the barbecue pit that had been set up behind the hardware store. Two men argued over the proper sauce-to-meat ratio, each insisting their grandfather had entrusted them with sacred culinary knowledge. Hollis gave them a nod as he passed. They nodded back without interrupting their argument. As he reached the corner that opened onto the square, he saw it. The barricades, the chairs, the gathering crowd, the swirling heat, and, tied to a fence with a rope that clearly lacked commitment, the donkey. Nebuchadnezzar. He had seen the donkey earlier from a distance. Seeing him up close only confirmed Hollis's suspicion. This animal had opinions, strong ones. The donkey stared back with a glowering intelligence that suggested he had already taken stock of the situation and found it beneath him. "Don't start," Hollis muttered. The donkey blinked slowly, a gesture that carried the emotional weight of a man saying, "Oh, I'll start when I'm good and ready." Hollis sighed. He wasn't even at the parade yet, and the day was already getting complicated. He pushed forward. Fitzhog's house felt a long way off. He hoped it wasn't getting any further. Chapter 3. Heat Rising Over Hamburg Square. Hollis hadn't expected the morning to feel like late afternoon, but July had a way of getting ahead of itself in Arkansas. By the time he reached the outskirts of Hamburg Square, the heat had gained a full hour on the clock. It pressed against him as he walked, the sun working like a foreman, hollering orders at the humidity to lift more, push harder, and sweat faster. The closer he came to town, the louder everything got. It wasn't a sudden explosion of noise, more like layers of sound stacking themselves on top of each other until they formed a single, indistinguishable roar. Children laughing, people arguing in good spirits, fired-up gasoline engines, unsupervised firecrackers turning up where no one expected them, a brass band warming up on the courthouse lawn, or what passed for the courthouse lawn these days. Hollis paused at the corner by the old cafe, the building long ago repurposed as a place that sold catfish on Fridays and little else the rest of the week. A hand-painted banner hung from its awning, 1776 to 1976, Hamburg Remembers. He wondered how many of the people celebrating today could name what exactly they were supposed to remember. Probably not many. But they remembered enough to get sentimental over it, and that was close enough for most folks. He drifted forward, scanning for a gap in the barricades. Flimsy wooden sawhorses the city hauled out for everything from parades to water main failures. Today they stood proudly like foot soldiers guarding the imaginary republic. A woman in a bicentennial shirt waved at him from her folding chair. Hollis nodded back. He didn't know her name, but she had the sort of open, agreeable face that suggested she had spent most of her life waving at acquaintances and near acquaintances. Some people seemed built for community, like they'd been poured into the mold from birth. Hollis admired that without wanting it for himself. He tried one route down an alley and found it blocked by a pickup truck loaded with coolers and a family of 7 eating popsicles for breakfast. He tried another path and found it cordoned off by a group of masons adjusting their sashes. The third attempt took him past a barbecue pit where 2 men argued over whether ribs should be boiled before smoking, each deeply committed to the belief that culinary disagreement was a form of treason. Everywhere Hollis looked, there was something happening. A young man in denim cutoffs fired a bottle rocket from the end of a Coke bottle and then looked genuinely surprised when it veered into the crowd. A little girl dragged a red wagon holding a baby doll whose hair had melted into a single plastic mass from too much sun exposure. A woman fanned herself with a church bulletin that read, "Christ first, country second." though the size of her flag pin suggested the order could have gone either way. The entire spectacle ran on a combination of sugars, sweat, and nostalgia powerful enough to power a small grid. Hollis continued moving through it all with the vacant determination of a man looking for a misplaced item, which in a sense he was. A path, a gap, a route to the far side of town, something that would get him to Harlan Fitzhugh without a series of small-town trials designed to test his patience. He stopped in front of a lemonade stand run by two kids who looked like they had been drafted into service against their will. Their sign read, "Lemonade 10 cents, maybe colder later." Hollis reached for his pocket, then paused. He didn't really want lemonade. It would just add another complication. A cup to carry, a sticky hand, a search for a trash can that wouldn't appear until he no longer needed one. He nodded to the kids, who nodded back in the solemn manner of overworked shift workers, and he moved on. A faint sound floated over the square, one he recognized without wanting to. A trumpet slowly worked its way through the melody of "In the Sweetened By and By," except the musician had not yet settled on the key and seemed in no hurry to do so. The wobbling, brassy attempt at spiritual reassurance wove itself around Hollis's ears like a memory trying to land. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. The hymn had followed him through childhood, through war, through the long years after. It appeared at weddings, funerals, revivals, and potlucks. It appeared on the wind sometimes for no reason at all. It belonged to everyone and therefore belonged to no one, and yet it seemed determined to attach itself to Hollis whether he wanted it or not. He opened his eyes again and kept walking. At the edge of the square he stopped. There, tied loosely to a short length of fence near the Legion Hall, stood a donkey, thin, hungry-looking, and radiating the sort of distrust usually reserved for tax collectors. Hollis stared at him. The donkey flicked an ear. The tag on the fence said, "Nebuchadnezzar, do not touch." Someone had added "seriously" beneath it in marker. "Of course," Hollis said under his breath. The donkey chewed, stared, then resumed chewing. In another few minutes the parade would form. People would start clustering, the square would close completely, and whatever route Hollis needed would vanish under a tide of patriotism. He needed to move soon. But the heat, the noise, the hymn drifting through the air, and the sight of a donkey named Nebuchadnezzar was enough to make him pause longer than he intended. Sometimes you had to admire the world's ability to surprise you, even when you didn't ask it to. And so, in the midsummer brightness of a bicentennial Arkansas morning, Hollis Parnell took a breath, wiped his palms on his jeans, and prepared to enter the chaos properly. Harlan Fitzhugh was waiting somewhere beyond all this, and Hollis was determined to reach him, eventually.
Chapter 4. Barricades and Small-Town Diplomacy. By the time Hollis reached the first set of barricades, the bicentennial spirit had fully congealed into something resembling small-town law. A volunteer in a red vest stood beside the wooden sawhorses, fanning himself with a clipboard that appeared to have no actual purpose. The man's hat read, "Hamburg Bicentennial Security," which suggested either a degree of seriousness or a degree of irony, depending on how closely one looked at the stitching. The man narrowed his eyes as Hollis approached. "Morning," said the volunteer, though it was clear he felt the morning had already lasted long enough. "Morning," Hollis replied. "You headed through here?" "I was hoping to." The volunteer sighed as if Hollis had just asked him to adjudicate a boundary dispute between feuding clans. "Can't let vehicles through. Parade staging area." "Wasn't bringing a vehicle." The volunteer studied him like a man evaluating whether this technicality deserved respect. "Well," he said finally, "we're technically closed to foot traffic, too." Hollis looked past him. The street beyond was alive with preparation. Shriners polishing their go-karts, members of the garden club adjusting floral arrangements, local politicians practicing hand waves that conveyed sincerity from 20 yards away. "Looks open to them," Hollis observed. The volunteer turned around as if surprised to find the street bustling. "That's different. They're supposed to be there." "So am I." This answer felt true to Hollis, even though it wasn't true in any meaningful sense except the spiritual. The volunteer took a long breath through his nose, reconsidering the entire concept of civic responsibility. "What exactly you need through there?" he asked. Hollis folded his arms. "Trying to get to the other side of town." "Why?" "Need a part." "A what?" "A part." The volunteer blinked several times as if this exchange would eventually begin to make sense. "You from here?" he asked suspiciously. "All my life," Hollis said. This seemed to settle something. The volunteer nodded slowly, adopting a tone reserved for old men explaining fishing techniques to younger ones. "Well, if you're from here," he said, "you should have known better than to try crossing the square on the 4th. Hollis said nothing. The man wasn't wrong.
Just then, a woman pushing a stroller approached the barricade, nodded politely, and walked straight past without a word. The volunteer didn't stop her. Hollis looked at the volunteer. The volunteer looked back. The unspoken question hung between them like a wet towel. Finally, the man stepped aside a full 18 inches, just enough space for a person, provided that person turned sideways, held their breath, and believed strongly in the concept of personal dignity. "All right," the volunteer said, "make it quick." Hollis nodded in a manner that conveyed gratitude without enthusiasm and ducked past the sawhorses. As soon as he crossed the imaginary line, the ambient noise increased by 30%. The closer he moved to the square's center, the more the air vibrated with preparations. A group of teenagers was setting up a float that featured a papier-mâché Liberty Bell roughly the size of a recreational vehicle. It leaned dangerously to one side, and the teens argued over who was supposed to reinforce the crack, which had been rendered less as a historic flaw and more as a design failure. Beyond them, a Baptist church had erected a small stage decorated with cardboard colonial hats and a banner reading, "Honoring Our Forefathers." One of the hats had collapsed onto a loudspeaker, giving the impression that a patriot from 1776 was trying to claw his way back into the world through modern amplification technology. Hollis threaded through the crowd like a man tiptoeing across a yard full of sleeping dogs, each likely to wake up and demand his attention. Near the gazebo, someone had set out several lawn chairs with hand-drawn name signs taped to the backs. Reserved for Parade Judge Number 1. Reserved for the mayor. Reserved for important persons. Below the last sign, someone had scrawled, "Not you, Randy," in what appeared to be permanent marker. Hollis didn't know Randy personally, but he sympathized with his situation. As he approached the shaded area beside the library, he heard a sudden metallic clatter behind him. A pair of Shriners were trying to unload a freshly painted go-kart from a small trailer, and gravity had taken issue with their approach. "You got it?" one said. "I had it," the other replied, holding a wheel like it had personally wronged him. Hollis gave the scene a glance, decided it was above his pay grade, and moved on. At the corner nearest the old hardware store, he found an unexpected pocket of quiet. A group of older men sat on a bench arranged under the only large shade tree on the square. They were not participating in the festivities so much as observing them with the detached curiosity of ornithologists studying a rare bird. One of them lifted his chin in greeting. "Hollis?" "Morning," Hollis said. "You fixing something?" the man asked. "Trying to." "Good luck. Town's full of fools today." Hollis considered offering some reassurance or perspective, but he had neither readily available. He simply nodded and continued walking. He was almost to the center of the square when the noise shifted once again. This time it wasn't a scattered chaos of preparation. It was coordinated, rhythmic, terribly earnest.
A marching band was beginning its warm-up, and not with just any song. In the Sweet By and By. The brass instruments attacked the melody from several directions at once, creating a sonic effect Hollis could only describe as accidental surround sound. The hymn filled the air, weaving itself into the heat like it belonged there. He paused. The day was gathering itself, pulling its pieces into position. Soon the parade would begin. And once it began, getting across the square would be a whole new ordeal. Hollis squeezed his hands into fists and released them. He still had time, barely. But the noise was rising, the heat was rising, and the day was only getting stranger. He pushed forward anyway. If he didn't get through now, he never would.
Chapter 5. The Square Tightens Its Grip. The square had a way of drawing people inward, like one of those antlion pivots Hollis had seen out behind the barn as a boy. You didn't have to be careless to slide into the center of it. You just had to take one step too many. And by the time Hollis realized he'd crossed the invisible line between in the way and in the middle of it, the crowd had thickened behind him like a plugged drain. He tried to move forward, but a checkout line of humanity formed in front of him. People talking, pointing, rearranging children, checking watches that weren't synchronized with anything except their own opinions of punctuality. Everywhere he looked, the crowd leaked into the street like something spilled. A man in a tricorn hat stepped directly in front of him and raised both hands. "Sir, sir, you're stepping into the staging area." Hollis blinked. "The what?" "The staging area," he repeated, adjusting his hat as though the hat itself granted him authority. "This is where the Founding Fathers will be lining up." "I don't see any," Hollis said. "They'll be here." Hollis nodded vaguely, stepping aside, though not far enough to signal agreement. The man resumed his brisk, unnecessary movements, which involved repositioning people who had not asked to be repositioned. Hollis wondered how many of the Founding Fathers would have tolerated being told to stand on a piece of masking tape. A burst of firecrackers cracked behind him. A toddler burst into tears. A teenager shouted, "That wasn't me," which was the surest sign that it definitely had been. The mother of the toddler shot the teenager a look that had traveled down at least 4 generations of Arkansas women, sharp enough to shave bark, but wordless, because words waste time. Hollis kept moving. He tried to avoid the cluster forming around the square center gazebo, but the crowd pinched inward like lungs exhaling, and suddenly he found himself right beside the judging table. 3 folding chairs sat behind a card table covered in a red plastic cloth. Clipboards were arranged neatly, as though accuracy had ever played a role in parade judging. In front of the table stood Bobby Dan Whitaker, the self-appointed master of ceremonies, a man whose enthusiasm had the misfortune of outweighing both his voice control and his sense of proportion. "Folks, if y'all could please clear the way just a little bit more, the parade marshals need space to breathe," he shouted into a microphone that trebled everything except clarity. Hollis stepped back, though not quickly enough. Bobby Dan's eyes lit up with recognition. "Well, I'll be Hollis Parnell. Y'all, we got a veteran right here. Korea, ain't that right? Why don't y'all give him a hand?" Hollis felt his stomach drop. Before he could protest, a cluster of nearby bystanders clapped politely, some out of sincerity, some out of reflex, and one man because he seemed to think hollering was involved and wanted to be part of it. Hollis lifted a hand half an inch in acknowledgement, then escaped sideways with the slow dignity of a man sliding out of a church pew during the second verse of a hymn. He had almost made it back into the flow of the crowd when he heard a familiar voice coming from a table off to the right. And after Cap Gates got turned down, that's when they put the mill in Crossett. Whole county changed because of that decision. Folks'll argue otherwise, but facts don't bend. J.W. Buckner stood beneath his borrowed white tent, speaking with the calm authority of a man who had said these words enough times to trust them unconditionally. A small group gathered around him, some listening, some merely appreciating the shade.
In front of Buckner sat his collection of pamphlets and maps. Some were dog-eared, some were hand-drawn. One map appeared to be traced over from memory with a ballpoint pen that had given up halfway through Ashley Township. Buckner spotted Hollis. He nodded once, the greeting of two men who didn't need to waste words. "Morning, Hollis." "Morning." "Hot today," Buckner observed. "Seems like it." Buckner leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You know they got the garden club stationed right by the Shriners again, same as 68. That gonna cause a problem? Last time it did." Hollis didn't have to ask what happened in 68. The story was well known. A Shriner had lost control of a go-kart and plowed directly through a floral display depicting Noah's Ark. The club's interpretation of the event had been theological. "Appreciate the warning," Hollis said. "Don't say I didn't try." Hollis walked on, slipping back into the flow of the crowd. As the minutes ticked on, the atmosphere thickened. The band warmed up again, this time closer to the melody, but farther from the rhythm. Someone fired a test cannon for a Revolutionary War reenactment, and half the square flinched in unison. A woman lost her purse and accused 3 different children before finding it under her chair. Hollis kept scanning for an opening. He needed a path, any path that didn't involve shoving through Cub Scouts dressed as colonial militiamen. But every time he angled toward a potential exit, the crowd contracted as if the square had decided to keep him a little longer. Then he heard a bray. Not a horse, not a mule, a long, hoarse, deeply offended donkey bray. Nebuchadnezzar. Hollis turned and saw the donkey standing near the Legion Hall, ears rotating independently, eyes narrowed with dark understanding. The rope tied to the fence looked looser than it had 10 minutes ago. "Lord help us," Hollis murmured. Every instinct in his bones told him what was coming. And whatever it wasn't going to help him get across this square. Not even a little bit.